Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. It is an absolute honor to have Adam Scott Bellos on. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here, especially given the prestigious guests that you've had on prior to me. It's very humbling to have been asked to join you.
Thank you so much. So if you could just briefly tell our audience a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. I grew up in the Midwest. My whole family's from Chicago. I was a fifth generation born American in Chicago, and I was raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. I made Aliyah about 14 years ago, studied at the University of Arizona and have a Judaic and Middle Eastern history degree. And then I did my master's in Middle Eastern history at Tel Aviv University, served in the Army, in Hebron and Bethel in the civil administration. And 9 years ago, I started the Israel Innovation Fund. And the goal with creating the organization was to build and is to build a new type of Zionist institution. I like to say the SpaceX to the Jewish world's NASA. We focus on perpetuating Zionism as a movement and as a national liberation movement. We have 4 projects right now. Our flagship project that we've been working on for quite some time is called Wine on the Vine, where we allow people to plant grapevines instead of trees and vineyards instead of forests. And then we have a Hebrew project and a self-defense project. Our Hebrew project is called the Bat Yehuda Project, or the nickname for it is the Hebrew Nanny Project, where we are working to build an infrastructure to send Hebrew-speaking au pairs to Jewish homes so that over the next 20 years, we can create a bilingual Hebrew-speaking diaspora. And then our self-defense project is called Shomrei Ha'am, which is a self-defense project where we are going to send, let's say, 5 to 20 different Krav Maga, Madrich Krav Maga teachers to the diaspora in every city that we have a concentrated Jewish community, utilize all the pipelines of schools, federations, Chabad, synagogues, etc., to provide subsidized Krav Maga to the community. Our goal is that self-defense in Hebrew literacy will be just as important for preparing for your bar mitzvah as learning Shacharit, Mariv, the Torah service, and everything else that you learn and reading the Torah. And together, those 2 projects, we're going to be rebranding them. And I like to call it Project Maccabee, really. And that's really kind of how I like to explain it, because we're trying to build Hebrew-speaking, self-defending Jews. And that has never existed outside of the land of Israel, ever, in the diaspora.
Right.
So, and then our final project is called Herzl AI. We're working to bring Jewish figures to life, to be able to interact with them and to get guidance and advice from them. So we're working to create an interactive Herzl that is an AI avatar based on all of his writings, speeches, books, and plays, so that you can interact with the founder of the Zionist movement and understand how he would interpret things of today, but also to answer the questions of where he was as he built the Zionist movement. So we really are looking not to create something for Hasbara, but for Jewish education and to create a greater bond with the next generation in the Zionist movement.
Excellent. That's so interesting and amazing work. And I'm looking forward to seeing more and more growth. So I want to just get into some questions that I have for you. What do you see as the main causes of the disconnect between Jewish leadership and the everyday Jewish community? And how does the culture of gala dinners and celebrity influencers taking money for advocacy play into that gap?
So I think that the culture of giving is a very cyclical one. It's done by the same families. You'll notice that a lot of the influencers are related to these big families. I think it's really just comes down to class warfare in a way. I think it's a very elitist culture. I think that there's a huge disconnect between I don't think there's anything wrong with having a gala. Okay, the thing that I have, the problem that I think is visible is that while we have hostages underground who have not been fed, while Israelis are living in a state of perpetual war where mortgage payments have doubled and there is such a huge disconnect with what Israelis are going through, I just think it's very obnoxious to see American Jews dress up in tuxes and cocktail gowns and acting like they're the heroes of the Jewish people because they're attending these events. I think it's become more about being seen than actual result or measurable results. And as you now know, and that has been made public, many of these organizations that have been hosting these ridiculous perpetual galas throughout, the last couple of years since October 7th has happened, have all been exposed for major financial, misappropriation, so to speak, or irresponsibility. So it is very disappointing. I just find that we're rewarding activism over thought, and we're not empowering thought leaders. And it's really about how big of a check you can write or how many followers you have. And I just think there's a very big difference between a following versus having a plan. And I don't find that any of the major influencers that are being propped up or being paid tens of thousands of dollars, as which was exposed by Daniel Mel earlier, was that, the AJC gave over $500,000 to Zach Sage Fox to make videos. Okay, some of those videos are really great, but what have they accomplished? The strategy isn't working. And I think that's the major disconnect. What I don't understand is, where is the plan to defend the Jewish people in the diaspora? I don't need to laugh anymore. I don't need to look at 90-second content. I really don't care who's got a Birkin bag. I don't care what gala you're going to. If these people are so brilliant and so great, why has there been no plan that has been written to figure out the issues of Jewish education or the root problems that are causing the disconnect between Israel and the diaspora? So I think at its core, it's just a very shallow idea of creating community, because really it's just a community for those who can write those $500, $5,000 checks. When at the end of the day, the majority of the Jewish people are not the elites. And we've never been that way, in my opinion. And the Zionist movement was about getting away from that hubris and embracing the humility of working the land. And that is really, in my opinion, the great thing about Israel is that it is a very humbling place. And it was built on the backs of those who took off their shirts and worked the land and got a tan.
Right. And I'm always disappointed when I see people have a platform and they'll be invited onto CNN, and when they're accused of, being Zionists, they won't actually, some of them do, but they won't correct them or explain what Zionism really
Mm-hmm.
means. Yeah,
I think
it's a problem.
I think the biggest thing that has become very clear is that just because you have a large Instagram following doesn't mean you're an expert in defending the Jewish people. For me, I was very upset to see in the beginning of the war, Emily Austin went on Piers Morgan and she couldn't name the year the 1929 riots happened. And, I really give, credit to everybody that's trying to defend the Jewish people. But if you don't know the basic facts of the history of this conflict, or how and why things happened, or what each building block was that has led us to today, you need to keep your mouth shut and let the experts do the talking. And this is the problem with the Instagram generation, is that there's this cycle of narcissism and this need for attention versus achievement, if that makes sense. I feel like it's the DEI, so to speak, of this generation, which is not wanting to earn the expertise. And it's the elimination of meritocracy. So, if you built a following on being a fashion person, you can't all of a sudden just become this expert in Israel. And it's how you get people to make content about things that are really factually incorrect, and in my opinion, create more anti-Semitism in many respects. And I want to go back to one other thing that you asked me about, the galas. If there is anything that perpetuates the idea of the wealthy Jewish conspiracy, it is the way people showcase the galas, in my opinion. And I think it's a very irresponsible thing to have the same people all the time be honored, given these awards, who really haven't achieved anything other than making an Instagram post, who are clearly flaunting their wealth in front of everybody publicly. And I just don't think that's a Jewish value.
Well said. Absolutely. So this ties into the next question, because it has to do with, influence. If it's treated as a money game, that puts us at a permanent disadvantage, especially when nations like Qatar can outspend us by billions. So what alternative models of influence or leadership should we be building?
I think I guess you could say the most important thing, which has been ignored, is reinvesting in the infrastructure of Jewish education. and providing the opportunities for every single young Jew to be able to access 3,500 years of tradition and the wealth of knowledge that's been given and handed down from generation to generation. We should not, how do I explain this? The whole point of advocacy is to be able to disarm somebody with your tongue. You shouldn't have to scream. You shouldn't have to raise your voice. And God knows, I've been there. And sometimes there's an appropriate time and place for raising your voice and using emotion and bringing that energy. But at the end of the day, you should be able to calmly take somebody down the line of sale of why the Jewish people have a right to the state of Israel, why and how the Jewish people are the indigenous people of the land of Israel. And if we look at the failure of Jewish education, I always like to say it comes down to this. You will know when Jewish education has succeeded when every young Jew can explain why they're not white.
Right.
And if that ever becomes a reality, you know that Jewish education has totally succeeded. Because when every young Jew can explain that the Jewish people are the first victims of Western imperialism, were thrown into cages in Hebron and sold in the markets of Rome as slaves, and that's the beginning of the Ashkenazi story, okay, which is the group of Jews that are constantly being accused of being white and colonizers and everything else. You know, those are the basics that young Jews aren't able to connect in their mind because they were never given the actual shoresh of the root and the essence of what our experience has been and what the story of our nation in exile is and was. So, personally, investing in our infrastructure, educationally, providing the tools that are necessary for Jews to engage in their texts, making Hebrew and specifically self-defense the main priority, building modern Maccabees is the way to move forward, in my opinion. There is no greater gift that you can give a young Jew than the ability to be a Hebrew-speaking, self-defending, modern-day Jew.
Absolutely, absolutely. How can Jewish communities protect themselves from rising hostility without slipping into isolation? And at the same time, why is Israel losing the PR war so badly despite its resources and talent? Because I would imagine they say, Jews run Hollywood, Jews run the media. If that's the case, then we're doing a terrible job. I don't think it is true, but
Well,
but it's just kind of like upsetting when you see that we're failing so miserably at getting our messaging across.
I I think there were so many questions that you just asked me. Wow, give me the first one. We'll
All
go
right,
down the line of questions.
sure.
What was the first one?
So basically, how can the communities protect themselves from rising hostility without slipping into isolation?
So um, there's easy ways to do that because you're in America or you're in England or you're in Australia and you're obviously not in the Jewish state where you're totally isolated. Uh, the records show that relying on outside sources for Jewish security never really pans out very well. I don't believe that uh, taking care of your own security and education means isolationism. And there's no real need for that. Now, there are many Torah observant communities that do believe in that and do live like that in different places in the diaspora. At the same time, most ethnic minority communities, which the Jewish people fail to see themselves as, especially in North America, which is a huge reason for a lot of the problems, in my opinion, that there are in the United States right now. Um, I do believe in taking a step back right now and refocusing our energy inwards and not necessarily worrying about what's going on with outside communities. Because at the end of the day, the Jewish community is extremely weak, fragmented, and unorganized at this time. I also believe that, I think you had asked me about the PR and things like that.
Yeah.
One of the things that's come out recently is that the Tel Aviv Institute was taking money from the Tides Foundation, which is funded by George Soros. Like, without giving any opinion on like the leadership of that organization or whatever, there is one thing that's very important is that we need to stop trying to blend Judaism or Zionism or Jewish life or Jewish culture into every modern woke or right-wing or left-wing ideal. It can't be everything. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. That is something. It doesn't mean it's going to mean the same thing to everybody that's outside of the Jewish community. Staying, concrete in values and ideals is extremely important, in my opinion.
Right.
So I don't necessarily, I'm not so worried about isolationism right now. That's the furthest thing from my mind.
Well, I
The
would say
most,
isolationism that we see happening in front of our eyes is, let's say, on college campuses. These are future leaders of America, and
Mhm.
students will feel like I can't wear a kippah, I can't.
Well, why? But I think the question really is why did that happen?
Right.
And how did that happen? And what Jewish leadership has been in power for the last 20 years that ignored it? Um, we look at the ADL, for instance, with a CEO that makes $1.2 million a year, who called the Biden administration's anti-Semitism policy a major breakthrough when it didn't say Israel, it didn't say Zionism, and it didn't say anti-Zionism in it at all, but it said Islamophobia more than 15 times. We try to universalize our experience. And universalizing the Jewish experience is really an assimilated way to try to get people to not hate us. When at the end of the day, every single generation that we have seen that has received violence every 100 years, there's always similarities. Like we're at the height of our power, we're at the height of our assimilation into that community. Our separateness is what makes us us. It doesn't mean that we have to be isolated, but it does mean that we have to have a strong enough identity to know the difference between us and the rest of the world. If we truly believe in the destiny of the Jewish people, in my opinion.
I think nationalism also just got a bad name just over the years, and
if you look at the 2016 election, instead of saying fascism, they said nationalism, and I think that was a great disservice to the understanding of not only what nationalism is, what nationalism did for the world, moving it from monarchy to nation states,
right?
But also, I mean, it's the same thing what's happening right now when they say that Israel is committing a genocide. You can't just give a word a new definition. There's a reason why communism means communism and socialism means socialism and capitalism is capitalism. Fascism is not nationalism. Fascism is extreme nationalism to a point where you're basically promoting the killing of everybody that's not a part of your nation. That's not nationalism. Nationalism is the right for everybody to have their own nation. And the denial of people to have their own national affiliation is anti-nationalism.
Right. And some people like to prefer to use the word patriotism instead because I guess it hits differently. But yeah.
Yes, but you're patriotic to your nation.
Yeah. I mean, we see also the failures of multiculturalism around the world. So some nations are actually like Poland, for example, are taking more steps towards nationalism. It's not a bad thing. It's sometimes when they overreach with the multiculturalism and then things go haywire and then you wonder why. Then they have to overcorrect. And I think that if people really appreciate what Zionism really means, they would obviously have a different perspective. But the opposition to Israel has done an amazing job of just constantly mentioning that Israel is Nazism, Zionism is Nazism, and just keep repeating the same lie, and eventually people will believe it. That's exactly what happened. And I haven't seen enough pushback against the kind of language. Like the genocide is constantly thrown out, the ethnic cleansing, and like a lot of times I get very frustrated because they'll just say you're an anti-Semite, that's their answer, and that doesn't work. Like that's kind of like a bad.
Well, anti-Semitism was a term that was coined specifically for anti-Jewish hatred. Now because of the inability for people to defend themselves, people like Jew hatred instead of anti-Semitism, which is, I mean, it works. It's a little bit more direct. I mean, but again, everything that you're talking about comes down to a lack of education, a lack of understanding, a lack of historical context, and what I would say is a fear of non-Orthodox communities to truly embrace certain things that maybe are hard for them to grapple with, given the fact that they're not Torah observant. I grew up in one of those communities. I don't really see, back in the day, it used to be you were Shomer Shabbat or you're not.
Yeah.
Okay. And I still don't think there's anything wrong with that. People have the right to live the Jewish life that they want to live. I have tattoos. Okay. I have 3 tattoos. It doesn't mean that it's correct or halakhically permissible. I just chose to do that. Okay. I marked myself for October 7th. It was something that I felt and many other Israelis who lived through the experience felt that we needed to do to have a constant reminder of what we experienced on that day. Okay. That doesn't mean it's halakhically permissible. And there's not, in my opinion, in today's world, there's nothing wrong with choosing the life that you want to choose. But when you don't have the education to be able to it's like what Ahad said, you got to know the rules to break the rules. And if you don't give people the opportunity to understand what they're choosing or what they're choosing against, then you hear all this tikkun olam this or Jewish value this or occupation Shabbat, Passover, and all this code pink crap. And you start, pink washing and whitewashing what rabbinic Judaism was trying to give to the Jewish people while they were in exile. And it's a very sad thing because you not only that, but people that don't grow up with Jewish literacy or how to do Kiddush, or what like the experiences of Shabbat and doing the blessings from candle to Kiddush to hand washing to bread, and they're ignorant to the environments that they're in, it makes them feel self-conscious. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's the center of Reform Judaism. I was very fortunate that my parents sent me to Jewish day school. It was a conservative Jewish day school. And the one thing that this school wanted to make sure was that you could survive in any Jewish environment. And the conservative synagogue that we went to was so hardcore about bar and bat mitzvah practice that it was about making sure that once you were a bar or bat mitzvah, you could daven in any shul around the world. And that was a unique thing for the conservative movement. I mean, it was more conservadox, and obviously before the conservative movement started going left. But the goal was give the education and the roots of what you need to be able to survive as a Jew in any synagogue on a Friday or a Saturday. And I remember my first time in Poland davening in an Orthodox shul. The kid sitting next to me, who later became a Reform rabbi, was freaking out because he couldn't understand anything that was going on. He goes, "This means nothing to me." And I'm thinking, no, you were just never taught how to actually be literate in, Kabbalat Shabbat or a Torah service or anything of that kind. I mean, if you're not taught Musaf, how are you gonna, participate? It's just, it's a very real epidemic, in my opinion, in the Jewish community, the denial of the right to have every child be given their inheritance of tradition and knowledge and text.
Yeah, one of the things that this Judaism Demystified podcast focuses on is getting back to the fundamentals. And one of the reasons why we wanted to start doing this is like we noticed, we were talking about this off camera, but we noticed that like even on Twitter, there's these Jew haters who come out and start pulling out, Agadot and cite like verses from the Talmud, and they'll just take it out of context and they'll throw it out there. And then the Jews, most of them are not able to respond. They're like, well, most Jews don't study the Talmud. That's their answer. Instead of actually knowing what the context is and what it's actually about, and it's not what they're saying it is. I agree. I totally agree. I think the lack of education is actually becoming very apparent. And in a way, it's a blessing in disguise because it's forcing Jews now to become a lot more refined in their understanding of Jewish text and being able to respond to these kind of accusations. So, in a way, it kind of seems like, so it feels like it's prophetic almost, like the Jews are coming back to the land of Israel, but also they're being exposed to the texts again, and it's being put in front of them whether they like it or not. And now you have to analyze this text. Now you have to understand, what does this text mean to you, and how do you defend your beliefs? I think it's a very unique time. It's a very unique opportunity for Jews to educate our own.
I mean, listen, I don't see enough being done. There is no, when I spent the last 10 months in exile, I took the time to write about 70 pages of two plans that, together, like I said, we call Project Maccabee. That was about diagnosing the problems that have led to the issues on campus, in the streets, to why Sarah and Yaron were gunned down, to why there has been violence and the steady increase of violence really since the Durban conference, and if not the beginning of the Second Intifada. Without us taking the time to step back and say, what is the illness and what is the cure to that illness, we're bound to repeat these issues, and we're bound to see more Jewish blood drench the streets of the diaspora and as well in the land of Israel. And Israel has its own problems compared to the diaspora. And one of the main problems that the state of Israel has is not understanding the diaspora because of who is put in those leadership positions. And also the same thing with the diaspora being that they're so disconnected, not only by distance, but by culture and language with Israel. We have to diagnose the issue, which is that Jews do not know how to defend themselves because they are not given the basic tools. Jews are pushed around because physical security, was not something that was necessarily needed for the majority of Jews in the diaspora. Now, I grew up in a home where I was told all of these stories of my father's experiences with anti-Semitism and the physical threat to his physical body and his need to physically defend himself. And the reason why we had guns in the house was because we were Jews and anybody could come to harm us at any time because we're Jews. So, the value of physical security and what I really call the Hebrew-speaking, self-defending Jew through Project Maccabee Hebraization. Okay, and the need for Hebraization of the modern Jew in the diaspora is what, in my opinion, is the cure to securing a safe and prosperous diaspora. Because we have to ask ourselves, is the diaspora always going to exist? Now the answer is, 99% yes. Okay. Well, then you have to say, given the situation and the rise of anti-Semitism and the situation that we have now, is it going to be a weak or a strong diaspora? Now, obviously, if it's going to exist, it needs to be strong. But then you have to define what is a strong diaspora. Because and then what is a strong diaspora? Well, it's filled with strong diaspora Jews. What is a strong diaspora Jew? Well, the early Zionists define this. It's a Hebrew-speaking, self-defending Jew rooted in tradition who does not walk looking down, but walks with his eyes up and forward. That is the answer to our problems. It is very simple. Every generation figures another thing out to benefit the next generation. It's like the Shema teaches us to hand it down to the next generation, to teach this and impress this on to your children. Every generation added to the Talmud before it was compiled. Okay, when we ignore the basic things of Jewish evolution and the evolution of the Jewish experience, we're bound to lose quite a lot of people. Because if you really think about it, and this is a very controversial thing for me to say, what is the reason that 6 million Jews died in Europe?
I'm scared to answer. So,
In my opinion, now I don't put all of the blame on this, but I think the rabbinic elite are extremely responsible in many respects. They were afraid to leave. They didn't want to encourage people to leave. They felt that there was a need to wait for redemption and wait for Mashiach instead of building it and bringing it themselves. And it doesn't matter what you think about redemption or Mashiach, or if you're into the mystical or whatever,
it
or you
does
believe in
matter.
certain
It does
things.
matter because you should see prophecy as a call to action rather
You, you
than,
should
yeah.
you should see prophecy as a call to action. At the end of the day, we are always worried about. I'm trying to explain this in the most open, broad way possible without narrowing it, excluding anybody. But my point is that you can't expect a people to survive if you don't embrace the new things that the next generation can teach you. And when people are knocking at your door with pitchforks, maybe it's time to leave. And if you look at, one of the things that is constantly repeated these days is, now we understand how and why Jewish communities stayed before they were ultimately destroyed. Because a lot of people from Israel are seeing, the rise of anti-Semitism in all of Europe and England and America and Canada and Australia, the way that we read about what happened 100 years ago. And it's very sad. Imagine if the rabbis in the 1920s, as the pogroms happened and the Zionist movement was starting to pick up steam, if they weren't against the Zionist movement and they were for people picking up and moving to the land of Israel, you'd have a completely different experience in Israel. You'd have a completely different history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and you would have had less Jews die in Europe. I know that's an extremely
No, it's not. It's not. I've heard the rabbi of our shul has made the same kind of comment that all the rabbis of many of the rabbis in Eastern Europe perished in the Shoah because they didn't see what was coming and they didn't take it seriously enough and they weren't into Zionism. But then
if
there
you
was
if you
another,
can't respect the human aspects of what the Geula is supposed to be,
yeah,
like, you can't interpret Torah correctly. There's 70 faces to Torah. We're supposed to be able to take, and I'm just thinking about the episode that I had just listened to of yours, which was the questioning of belief, or
yeah.
and like, he was hitting on so many things about when it's literal and when it's not, and the complexity of the lessons. And I was saying this to you earlier, if you look at, like, the creation of the state of Israel in the last 75 years, you can compare it so well to Shoftim through, Solomon. And if you look at, every 100 years, you can always compare it to the next 100 years, because we've constantly experienced this wave of anti-Semitism that destroys a community, or a community uproots itself to the land of Israel because of it. So I just think it's rather telling that in the name of observing Hashem's laws, people were forced to stay or told to stay, which ultimately led to their slaughter.
Yeah.
And it's a very sad and difficult thing to really discuss, in my opinion.
But what's actually amazing about our tradition is that if you notice, even the Agadah, famous story in the Talmud about Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, just to make a long story short, this Jew was humiliated in front of all the elites, all the rabbis who were sitting at the table, and they stayed quiet. These are stories written by the rabbis. Whether or not it's a true story or not, they're trying to paint a picture of the kind of time that they were living in, and they were blaming themselves in a way and saying like the leadership didn't step up when they needed to, and even the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. We're always learning on Tisha B'Av. What did we do wrong, and what did like the leaders will say that the rabbis were not getting along with each other.
They were sacrificing animals instead of feeding people
Right.
during the siege of Jerusalem. It's just funny that you mentioned Kamsa Bar Kamsa, because I bring that story up all the time when talking about my own experience of trying to sound the alarm of what I saw happening over the last 20 years. And, I've been blackballed by a lot of mainstream Jewish organizations. A lot of people take my professional criticism personally. Before I started my organization, I tried to bring one small organization in Israel and one of the major legacy organizations together to start building the infrastructure for communities to be prepared for the coming anti-Semitism, so that there would be infrastructure for new immigrants coming into Israel, given the rise that was on its way up. And, this organization, they both went off, both organizations went off and did their own thing. I was cut out of a partnership. The bigger organization gave the other organization $250,000 and an $80,000 salary to somebody. And I'm the one who put everything together and was the one who said, I'm going to put it together to professionalize this organization. And it was my first professional win, but I got no credit for it. And it was very destructive. That person is dead. That Adam died when that happened. And it was because I was so idealistic, Zionistically and Judaically, of thinking that no matter what, if my intentions were pure, no one was going to try to destroy me. And it was a very hard thing to learn and go through, because it was so embarrassing. And there were so many things that were said about me to discredit my version of events after that. And it's the first time I'm talking about it publicly. Actually, I can't believe you got me to do that. And it is a very real thing that we are experiencing. I see it all the time with what we do with TIFF and Wine on the Vine, and the excuses that rabbis and communities make to not buy Israeli wine, and how they use mivushal or this and that or this thing and this thing as an excuse to not purchase the product, when Israeli wine is literally the symbol of redemption. It is literally the tool that is the greatest thing to connect a young person to Israel. It is your history in a cup, our story in a bottle. It is, the fulfillment of 2,500 years of hopes and dreams fulfilled. And I see it so often because we are told not to question leadership anymore. We are told not to question the mistakes that are made. We are told that if you speak up against a person, not only is it personal, but, we want to save lives. We want to stop Jews from dying. It should not be a problem to say, I don't agree with this policy, or maybe this might not be the right direction, or maybe placating to the left or to the far right or whoever is not necessarily the right way to go about things. And instead, we're vilifying those who are in dissent. And fortunately, since I've started speaking out about these things and about financial mismanagement and the ridiculous salaries that some of these organizations are taking without providing measurable results, now people are starting to be brave enough to speak up. And unfortunately, being a lone wolf in that area is very difficult. And not a lot of people have the strength to just take the hit after hit after hit until you're not the crazy person outside of the castle banging alone. Mm-hmm. And it's very true. Look what they did to Spinoza for asking questions. It makes somebody more extreme in many respects.
Yes.
And it's very unfortunate. A great example is Kahana in Israel. The only person that Menachem Begin ever spoke poorly about was Kahana. And Kahana acted very inappropriately at times, and he said very extreme things. And at the same time, instead of trying to work with him to mainstream him or de-radicalize some of the things that he was doing, it made him more extreme, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm not a Kahanist by any means whatsoever. But my point is that when you shut out the conversation and you're told that people aren't allowed to question anything and you just have to go with the flow, one, that's just against the counterculturalism of what created the Jewish people. And two, it's just a great way to create uh, dissent in the community, in my opinion.
Well,
Sorry, that was a long
no, no,
rant. I hope that was logical.
that was
Everything that I
absolutely
just said.
logical, and I see it even with these influencers today who are like kind of they sound like mouthpieces of the government. Like it's okay to question certain things that these are. Doesn't mean you're. But I get
I
it.
just
They
don't.
feel their
I
backs are
just
against the
don't.
wall.
I just don't see the point of half of the things that the influencers are doing because it's the same thing. They're all followed by the same people and they're all making the same content, or they're just trying to make something to continue their algorithm to go up. And it's kind of ridiculous. It's just like, who the excuse my language, has time to just sit around and go, hi, I'm from Israel and blah, 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 and I'm sitting here. Guys, let me tell you my opinion on this. Let me tell you my opinion on this. I want to hear somebody's opinion that has studied this conflict for 20 years.
Yeah.
I remember there was a feed that was created by an unknown woman, and it was called Jewish Orgs. And a lot of people thought it was me. And when I read it, I was like, oh, are they copying like everything I'm saying? Like this is like verbatim what I talk about. And I found out that it was some woman that works in a legacy organization that was starting to expose things that she saw. And they did a thing on when they brought all the influencers to Israel to report on the trucks going into Gaza. I don't know if you remember this.
Yeah.
All the influencers were making the same video. Okay. And they took now I'm a consultant for a high-ranking foreign ministry representative, so I couldn't collaborate on this post, even though I agreed with what they were saying. And they took all of the videos of everybody and put it like in one little box, and it was everybody. And it was like one of those things where everybody's saying the exact same thing, and it's like the conspiracy of like the
Yeah, yeah.
the one-minded
There's a
thing.
script. There's a script they're following.
Yeah, you've seen the local news thing where
Yeah,
they
yeah,
do
of
it, and
course.
everybody's it was supposed to be exactly like that, and I was accused of doing it. I just shared it, and I even wrote, I did not do this, but I agree with what they're doing, and what they're pointing out needs to be seen. Like, this
Yeah,
strategy isn't working. Okay, it's
yeah.
a bubble. That's it. And a lot of people accused me of doing something that I didn't do. And I finally said, I made a reel, and I go, I don't need to hide my face when I criticize people. F off. Like, I've been doing this for 20 years. You're
Yeah.
all new to the game. Like, you've all woken up post October 7th, or you just started doing this, or you had feeds before, and now you feel the need to do it, even though you didn't do it before, when really we wouldn't be in this situation if people were recognizing the direction that we were going in. If you couldn't see the writing on the wall by 2012, like, you are late to the game as to why the Jews are in the situation that we are in around the world, why our safety has come into question. And instead of us taking a step back and wanting to fix the situation at its root, we are perpetuating the same structure that was built for the 20th century and not for the 21st century. We are not answering the needs of 21st century Jews. And this influencer crap is exactly a great example of how the establishment is buying off people in order to perpetuate their demagogic hegemony over this community that is literally steering it directly into destruction, in my opinion.
And the
And
other side, it's a losing battle because the other side has more money and more people.
forget the money. Think about this. The Maccabees took on Greece, okay? And it's basically one of the reasons why the Greeks ended up falling. I mean, if you know the story, we were committing guerrilla warfare. We were waging guerrilla warfare, waging guerrilla warfare against the Greeks. Eventually, things got really crazy. And then Judah Maccabee and the Hashmonaim, they go to Rome and ask Rome to get involved and help. And that was ultimately the foreign policy decision that would lead to the destruction of the Second Temple, okay? And it's very interesting because during the destruction of the First Temple, we bet on Egypt instead of Assyria, and it was also a foreign policy decision, which is very interesting because the destruction of our sovereignty always comes from bad foreign policy decisions, which also affect our domestic policy and everything else, okay? So if you just look, if you can't question these things, there's a weakness there, in my opinion, and we can't continue to perpetuate the same mistakes that we're making, and we can't continue to perpetuate a type of leadership that is afraid of being authentically Judean and standing up for the rights of the Jewish people around the world in a way that may make them uncomfortable. I remember, and this is a great example, in December of 2023, I started to get the concept of what I wanted to do for Shomrei Am. And I sat with Natan Sharansky, who is a hero of mine, and I explained to him what I wanted to do. And he said to me that Jewish people, especially in America, want the police to protect them. And then he goes, what would Black Lives Matter think? And this and that and this and that. And I looked at him, and this was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I said, Natan, we need Jewish leaders who don't give a fuck about what other people think. Excuse my language. I'm sorry to the listeners. Bleep me out. Okay?
You're not the first one. It's okay.
Okay. And it didn't go. I mean, obviously the meeting ended, shortly after that. But my point is that we're always afraid to change. We're afraid to evolve. We're afraid. The idea of the new Jew, the muscular Jew, that Nordau, Jabotinsky, Ahad and Herzl began to really articulate all those identities together, even if you put a little Rob Cook in there. What all of these ideals that came from the Zionist movement that was to create this modern, spiritually connected, hardworking, land-oriented, Jew connected to the land of Israel, it was very much rejected. And it took a very long time for mainstream, the mainstream of the Jewish people to accept this as the direction that we needed to go in. And it's a very hard thing, to go from the height of an assimilated community to realizing that you're an ethnic minority and that you're not part of the mainstream and that you need to go internally to redefine what the community is, because that's the opposite of what these Jewish organizations want. At the same time, I want to say this. There's one main reason why creating modern day, fully authentic Jews is not in the priority of anything from the progressive to the ultra-Orthodox. It's because ultimately, either the generation that you're educating or the children of that generation will move to Israel, which means less money for those institutions and less donations. Because there's only one direction that you ultimately go in when you totally feel a complete and visceral Jewish identity through and through. And that is a deep connection to the land of Israel, and sometimes it's one that you can't be without.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for the rant.
No, please. I love it. It's so passionate. I think that, you mentioned one thing that, you want people who have been experts, who've been studying this stuff for 20 years and so on, and have nuanced views, and criticize whenever our leadership deserves to be criticized. But at the same time, like, I think of someone like Haviv Reti Gur, who's somebody who, like, I appreciate, his content.
Haviv is brilliant. He was an advisor to Sharansky. I actually, the first time I met Haviv was when I first moved to Israel and I made Aliyah, and he was working for Sharansky. He's a brilliant thinker and articulator.
But the thing is, we live in a time where people want sound bites, people want in-your-face kind of content. We have to compete with TikTok. That's where most young people are getting their information. So at the same time, is there room for, the influencers, or maybe do we have to kind of change their approach?
I wouldn't have any problem with influencers if their content was deep.
Right.
If you look at the type of content that I make, first of all, not a lot. I don't usually put my face on a lot of stuff. I did before, one of the things that I used to do that, kind of, I would do these rants and I would be kind of animated, but they were very, blah, 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 like filled with facts.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like my thing, is that I don't need a script and I have a lot of this off the top of my head. But one of the things that I would do is I would walk with my dog every morning with my coffee, and I would do my take on the things, that were complex issues or whatever. When my dog died, I went through, that was when I left the country for a little while, and I had to, it was a lot of things over 5 years in the war. And actually there's been 2 wars and many things that I've gone through over the last couple of years where I just needed a break. And it was really important because I was able to reconnect to my roots. I went back to the diaspora to understand the problems or whatever. It all goes back to education. Okay. It all goes back to education. And you want to know something? There's no reason why you can't become an expert through 30-second videos. At the same time, we're not creating alternative methods of learning for the different types of learning methods. Okay, you know how I love to study Torah now? And it is my favorite way to study Torah is Aleph Beta, the cartoons. It is one of my favorite ways. I don't know if anybody has seen the video that Rabbi Foreman did on the face of God.
Yes.
Did you see that?
The temple we're talking about, right?
And it was the Mishkan,
yes,
specifically. And that when you understand that the layout of the Mishkan represented this face, but it was the emanation of like the spirituality. Your listeners can't see what I'm doing with my hands, but if they could, they would totally get what I'm trying
Yes,
to,
yes, yes, yes. I've given a
articulate right now.
class. I've given a
Yeah,
class based off
I,
of that.
I,
Fantastic.
I love to talk about that, and you can become such an expert when you study the text and the grammar and the syntax and the importance of the Hebrew itself. And that's why I feel that Hebrew is such an important piece of the puzzle, and that we can't deny the next generation the right to be Hebrew speaking, self-defending diaspora Jews, because those are the nuances that we're missing. When you
Yes.
realize that when the first time the Birkat HaKohanim was given, and they say, may the face of God shine upon you, they mean something very specific. And
Right.
when you understand that this is, that's not, you can't get that just from reading the literal words. You can only get that by drawing the Mishkan and looking at it from a specific view. And once it's pointed out to you, you can't ever unsee it.
Yes.
It's just like how in Star Wars, when Luke Skywalker turns on his lightsaber for the very first time in Obi-Wan Kenobi's hut. Okay, now I am a huge Star Wars fan. My feed on Instagram and YouTube is like 3 or 4 things: the comic books, okay, Star Wars, and Jew stuff and movie stuff. Okay, so I'm very big into pop culture and content, but whatever. And it's probably one of the reasons why I love Aleph Beta. But I never noticed that the cord to turn on the blade, you can see it hanging in his shirt. Okay, now I've watched Star Wars thousands of times, and once that was pointed out to me, I can never unsee it, and it has
That's
ruined
amazing.
that scene. But you have a good point about the content and the sound bites and this and that. What sound bites are they? What sound bites are they? Who's making the sound bites? Why are we not concerned with figuring out a way to teach every Jew Torah in the way that they can learn it?
Yeah.
Didn't the Lubavitcher Rebbe say that people with Down syndrome were on like a higher spiritual level, and there was a need to be able to, they connected to specific things like tzitzit and other things, and that the need to appreciate like them as intellectuals and Torah scholars and their love of it's like that. You have to bring Torah. You can't, how do I say, you got to bring the mountain to Mohammed, not Mohammed to the mountain, so to speak. And that mountain of Torah has to be figured out in a way that can be articulated to every generation, to every type of student, to every type of child, whether they have trouble learning or not, whether they're auditorial or visual learners. It is what, I personally, I hate to read. Okay. I mean, I love to read. I read quite a lot. I'm sure you can tell, but I listen to all of my books on tape before I read the actual book, and then I'll listen to it again. I have to visually see it and hear it and get it in 3 different ways for me to really internalize it. It took almost 30 years for me to learn that. I didn't become a student until I did my master's. And I think, that's my answer to the soundbite issue. Sound bites are great. Sound bites are important. And yes, but when you have to reduce everything you say to a soundbite, or you judge people on their expertise based on making a 90-second video, I think you're doing a disservice to what has always been considered expertise or scholarship.
I think you gave an idea to some listener here who's gonna realize that we need an Aleph Beta for like Jewish history and Zionism.
100% we do. It's one of the reasons why we're trying to do the AI project that we're doing. And, hopefully we'll launch Ask Herzl very soon in conjunction with work with the Zionist archives. And we're obviously going to do I came up with it because somebody was like, Herzl had a playbook. Can you help me with a playbook with what you're asking? And I was like, God, I just wish I could ask Herzl.
Mm.
We have to find every single way that we can to give Torah, to give history, to give Zionism, to give, to any kid that we can. History especially, I always like to say this, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about when I talk about Jewish education. And where my understanding of God and Zionism and Torah all fit together. And I love this saying: the God of history is the God of Israel. And the God of Israel is the God of history. Because that was how I found my emunah, my emunah. Like, it was really through the study of our history and seeing the building blocks of history and how they've come together and how the 100-year cycle of our people constantly is repeated. And I mean, I think it's fascinating. Like I was saying earlier, if you really look at the building of the states and the Zionist movement until today, it very much mirrors similar things that happened in between Shoftim and the death of Solomon.
Yeah,
And I really, understanding our history and the context of our history, and the context of where we are now in a 3,500 year history is extremely, extremely important to the strength and the identity of who will inherit tomorrow when it comes to the next generation of our people.
absolutely. And I'm so happy you brought up Rabbi Foreman. We've had him on the podcast as well as Imu Shalev. And
I'm a huge fan, huge
yeah,
fan.
they're fantastic. But in general, like one of the things that we've my co-host and I, Bensi, what we've fallen in love with is the
I'm
Gush.
so sorry that I didn't get to meet Bensi today. I
Yeah,
hope that
yeah, yeah.
everything's okay.
Hopefully we'll have you on again one day and we can do it all together.
Bizrat Hashem.
But we with um Aleph Beta, but in general we really celebrate the Tanakh study that's happening in Israel right now, specifically the Gush Tanakh method, the focus on the language and intertextuality and chiasms and going into the history and we've had a bunch of episodes on this topic because if, like you said, if you learn the fundamentals, you can't unsee it, and it changes everything. So it's something that we really advocate for. And before we go, I just wanted to ask you,
Wait, I wanna comment on what you just
please,
said, but
yes,
don't forget what you want to ask me. I was telling you off camera about a friend of mine, who I think you should have on your program at some point, and he was arguing with somebody that I thought was a total waste of time, and it was a typical Nachlaot type of discussion. Okay, I don't know if you've spent time in Nachlaot, but it's the area where all the hippies live in Jerusalem. I always used to say I thought San Francisco was the weirdest place in the world until I discovered Nachlaot. Okay, so and we were having this argument about national burden and this and that and Torah study. And it was like, this guy really, he had the yeshiva shlingo and he could drop all this and that, but he didn't have the fundamentals that you couldn't unsee. It was exactly what you guys kind of try to get at, which is the dogma of the yeshiva world that doesn't allow you to open your eyes to the
yeah,
deeper meanings of certain things. And it just, what you said just really reminded me of that and how important it is to have those historical, archaeological, and anthropological understandings of the history of the Jewish people and Tanakh. I mean, it's just like how for years we always considered Mount Sinai to be in the Sinai Peninsula, and really it's most likely in Saudi Arabia. It's things like that. It's a little nuances. I'm sorry I interrupted you. You
please,
wanted
no,
to.
of course. I just wanted to say before we go, I wanted to let our audience know where they can find you, how they can reach you.
So you can follow me on Instagram at Adam Scott Bellos, Bellos. We have I would love it if all of your listeners would order Israeli wine for the upcoming high holidays. You can go to wineonthevine.com to do that. We deliver in the States. If you order a case of wine, which is 12 bottles, it's free shipping. You usually if you order it, it gets there within 3 to 4 days. Sometimes, depending on the day that you order, it could be 5. So I always suggest just ordering your wine a full week in advance, but it usually only takes 3 days. If you'd like to plant a vine and support the Israel Innovation Fund and help us build, you can do that at plantavine.org. And, we're going to be launching a large crowdfunding campaign soon for our pilot for Project Maccabee, the Hebrew language and the self-defense project. And you can go to, I write for Ynet, and I'm going to be starting a new column with the Jerusalem Post soon. So you can engage me there. Just better to WhatsApp me, but you got to get in touch with me in some way before I hand out my number. And I always like to say, if you have a problem with me and you don't have my WhatsApp, then you probably don't know me well enough to have a problem with me.
That's great. That's great. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining. This was
I
amazing.
just want to say I'm so honored and humbled that you asked me to come on your program. I mean, you've had some Torah giants, some real giants on this podcast. So it's extremely flattering and again humbling to have even been asked to join you. I hope I did an okay job.
It was a great job.
I've been very nervous the entire
No,
time.
you did an amazing job. Well, I appreciate that, and really all the best of luck to you with all you're doing. It's really amazing. Chazak Baruch, keep staying strong, and
Thank you, thank you, thank
yeah,
you so
thank you so
much.
much.